If you enjoy my narrations, or the music that I compose for these stories, make sure to like and subscribe. And leave a comment letting me know what types of stories you'd like to hear in the future. Enjoy the video. Alright, before we get into any of this, let me give a quick summary in regard to how the hell we even got ourselves into this situation in the first place. You see, my buddy Cal got laid off a few months ago. He was also kicked out of his girlfriend's place a few days later for not wanting to meet her parents or some shit. He couldn't afford another apartment just yet. One, because his saving skills are shit. And two, he insists on buying shots of patron silver whenever we go out. Because of this, he started staying at my box, aka studio apartment, until he got back on his feet. He eventually did land another job. However, since it paid considerably less than his old one, he still couldn't break rent for an actual apartment. But one day he'd stumbled upon an ad made by a family renting out their basement in a nearby neighborhood. It was also cheap as hell. He'd pretty much made up his mind on the spot. Shit was starting to get real cramped back at my place. So he called the dad back and they set up an interview. Cal heads over. They talk for a bit, he gets a house tour, and they make everything official. Nothing strange so far. He claimed that the dad and the rest of the family, little twin girls, a teenage boy, their adult son, a baby boy, and the mom, seemed perfectly normal and didn't give off any weird vibes. They seemed like a happy family. At first, that is. The only concern that the dad really raised was that Cal couldn't go upstairs or have guests over under any circumstances. And that seemed reasonable enough. Anyhow, the days start to pass and Cal settles back into a routine. He'd work, hang out with us afterwards, then go to his basement. He claimed that it was nice down there, pretty sparse, but warm and roomy enough. He'd give the dad $60 cash every week, and that was that. No problems. Shit started to get a little bizarre about a month and a half in, however. He got laid off work early one day, and came home and found nobody in the living room. This is the first time it had ever happened. Usually, the teenage kid, his name was Brian, and we'd always be playing video games or something. Cal decided to wander around for a little, in order to check out the place a bit more. He never really liked being there with Brian. Said it was always awkward, because he'd never respond when he'd ask him something. It didn't take long before he spotted something on the kitchen counter. It was a receipt from a hardware store. This is what it said on it. 4 buckets of red paint, a power saw, a sewing kit, 3 bottles of rubbing alcohol. He didn't really know what to think at first. While these items were obscure, he just assumed that the dad needed these for various projects he was planning. Looking flustered when he saw Cal holding the receipt. Cal just laughed it off and said something along the lines of, "Planning something big, huh?" I guess the dad sensed that Cal didn't find anything too strange because he just laughed along. "No, nothing. Just good to have those things on hand, you know?" was what he said back to him. A couple of weeks go by without incident before the strangeness starts ramping up. Cal said that late one night while he was watching a movie, he swore that he could hear a soft, anguished grunting coming from somewhere upstairs. Cautiously, he started making his way up there into the living room. He wandered around for a bit before pinpointing the sound. It was coming from a bathroom near the kitchen. This is where shit went from creepy to absolutely horrifying. The lights in the bathroom were off, but he could clearly hear people talking in there. It was the dad and Brian. They seemed to be arguing about something. This is how he claimed the conversation roughly went. "Shh, don't wake him. Dad, it hurts. Why are you doing this now? Can't wait till the 4th. You know that." Brian grunts again. It sounds like he's about to keel over in pain. "Son, relax, please. The pain's all in your head. Here, let me stitch it up for you." "Do we have to do this in the dark?" "Yes, I've told you. We can't let it see us, remember?" This is the point where Cal realized he'd stumbled upon something very wrong. He buckled up slowly and headed back downstairs. He tried to get a look at Brian in the morning, but he seemed fine. Well, more so that he was just acting the way he'd been before. Cal told me about all of this the next day. This didn't really scare me, however. I guess you could say that I have strange interests. I was into weird shit like this. And what Cal had just told me was about the most fascinating thing ever. I asked him to keep me updated. A few more days pass, and Cal's claiming that none of the family members are even talking to him anymore beyond basic communication. In fact, they were barely talking to each other either. In addition to that, he keeps hearing the strangest noises coming from upstairs at night, usually during the hours of 3 or 5 a.m. when everyone should be sleeping. Shit like heavy stomping, and multiple babies crying even though he'd only ever seen one, and hysterical laughter coming from the daughters. One time, it sounded like a power saw went on, only to be switched off abruptly. The dad had warned him about this beforehand, telling Cal that his wife was going through a stressful time and was starting to lash out at night, and to please not bother investigating if he heard anything. Now, I don't know what constitutes a stressful time in this situation, but this was certainly not normal. One day, the dad comes up to him and tells him they're having a family over in a few days and that he needed to find another place to stay that night. Cal said it was fine and asked which day in particular. However, he pretty much already knew. The 4th is what the dad says to him. What a surprise, huh? Anyhow, I get an idea once he finishes telling me all of this shit. If Cal wasn't just bullshitting this whole time, then this was a potential chance to see some crazy stuff. Now, I'm not entirely sure how legal what we did next was, but at the time, I didn't really care. I called up a friend of mine, Ricky, who works at a security shop, and asked if he could hook us up with some surveillance cameras, ones that picked up audio as well. I also told him about everything Cal had experienced. I wasn't surprised when he jumped at the idea. He was arguably more into the supernatural than I was. In fact, he came over straight away and we started planning. Cal was understandably hesitant at first. We were going into some weird shit, after all. However, we eventually managed to break him down on the basis of sheer curiosity. Some even better news arose when the mom apparently had to go out of town in order to pick up some family members sometime in the morning tomorrow. This was perfect, because the mom was usually the only one home between the hours of 9 a.m. and 3 p.m., since everyone else was either at school or working. The baby would be in daycare. Now, Cal had already told me that he'd be leaving yesterday. So they took the keys away from him until the 5th. I guess whatever they were deciding to do needed to be secretive. However, Cal had noticed that the dad would always put a spare key inside a small crack on the steps. This meant that we were all set to go. So it's about 6 a.m. on the morning of the 4th, and we're waiting inside an all-night diner roughly across the street from the house. We got there so early because we didn't really know exactly what morning meant to the mom. We watch as the dad drives off first with the baby and daughters. The adult son, Jake, was the next one to leave, and Brian followed suit soon after. After about 10:30 a.m., the mom finally peels out of the driveway. We wait for another 15 minutes just to make sure that she hadn't forgotten anything before we make our move. Walking as inconspicuously as we could, we cross the street and make our way to the house. Oh, I forgot to mention, Ricky's friend Phil also decided to tag along, making it 4 of us in total. As Cal had promised, the spare key was indeed inside the crack. We unlocked the door and hurried our way inside. We were hit with the vague smell of burning incense somewhere. Cal said that the family didn't usually do that, but we didn't bother checking it out. We didn't know when the mom was coming home after all. We didn't have time to waste. We started setting up cameras, one in the living room, one in the kitchen, one in the basement. We tried making them as discreet as possible, and I think we did a good job. I mean, there was no way you'd be able to spot them if you weren't looking in the first place. After covering the bottom floors, we decided to head upstairs. Cal had never been up there, so even he didn't know what to expect. But things got a bit peculiar here. All the doors up there were locked, including the bathrooms. Well, except for one. But it was a mostly empty room with one bed and one dresser. We decided to just set up a camera in there and one in the hallway. I'll have to admit, we were getting pretty anxious here, so that's when we decided to call it quits. 5 cameras were probably enough. As we were going down the steps, Cal swore that he could hear a baby crying somewhere.
I knew it!
I remember him saying.
They have 2 babies, don't they?
I guess that we somehow missed it the first time, so we strained our ears trying to catch it. After about a minute, the muffled cries of an infant did become audible. We started walking towards where the sound seemed to be coming from, and we were led to one of the locked doors. That's when we noticed something even stranger. The crying sounded muffled, like I was being suffocated or something. However, it wasn't intense or anything, just what you'd expect from a normal baby. Safe to say this shit was getting really weird. We didn't know what to do, so we decided to just get out of there. Just as we were about to step through the door, we noticed that Phil wasn't with us anymore. We didn't even notice that he was gone up to this point. I was sure that he was there when the baby started crying. We called out to him, but were met with no response. We were about to go back upstairs to look for him when he came out of the damn basement. We asked him what the hell he was doing, but he claimed that he was down there the whole time. In retrospect, that response really made no sense. But we just wanted to get out of there, so we didn't question him further. When we got back to my place, Ricky started setting up the video feeds in order for us to watch. As we sipped on some cheap beers while waiting for him, I noticed that Phil seemed really quiet. He hadn't said anything at all upon leaving the house. Really, I should have known that something was wrong right then. Maybe I did. Maybe I just didn't want to admit it. In any case, Ricky got the thing set up and we all gathered around the monitors. These are the notes that we took while watching. Living room, 12:05 p.m. The mother comes into the house, but she's alone. It seems that she hasn't actually brought any family over. In her hands, she's holding a small white box and sets it on the coffee table. Living room, kitchen, 12:05 to 3:37 p.m. These are the times where the mom is the sole inhabitant of the house. Nothing much happens here. She sits on the couch reading a book while the television plays in the background. Occasionally, she'll get up and go to the kitchen to grab some fruit or something. This goes on for a while. However, around 1 p.m., we notice something interesting that we hadn't before. She hasn't turned the page once. She just stares at the book. Living room, 3:37 p.m. This is when Brian comes home. As he walks through the door, he seems to make brief eye contact with his mom before heading down to the basement. Basement, 3:37, 4:08 p.m. Brian enters and steps onto the treadmill, starting a light jog. Cal says that this is strange as he's never done this before. Living room, 3:55 p.m. The two twins walk through the door at this point. The mother does not acknowledge them as they go directly upstairs. Upstairs hallway, 3:56 p.m. Using a key, the girls enter one of the locked rooms and close the door behind them. Upon recollection, it seems to be the one where the baby was heard crying. Basement, 4:01 to 4:35 p.m. Brian gets off the treadmill and drinks some water. He sits down on the couch for a while, seemingly catching his breath. After about 15 minutes of that, he gets back up and starts doing jumping jacks. Living room, 4:12 p.m. Jake comes home, and this time, the mother actually acknowledges him. She gets up and starts walking towards the kitchen. Kitchen, 4:12 to 5:12 p.m. Once there, Jake and the mother take a large pot out of the refrigerator and set it on the counter. It seems like they were having a lot of trouble lifting it up. Jake takes off the lid, revealing what looks like thick black liquid inside. They stir the pot for about 20 minutes before lifting it onto the stove and turning the heat on. An interesting note is that during the whole duration of the process, Jack and his mother seem to be talking casually, but not about what they're doing. The conversation is about Brian and how he's flunking science class. The liquid takes about 25 minutes before it starts boiling. Once it does, a light black smoke starts rising from the pot. Jake and the mother open up the pantry and take out gas masks, putting them on. The smoke eventually engulfs most of the room and covers the camera. At this point, we can only see vague shapes, and we assume to be Jake and the mother moving around, but not naturally. The mother seems to be walking back and forth in a bizarre manner, taking large, exaggerated steps while waving one hand in the air. Jake looks like he's twitching violently. Basement, 4:35 to 5:15 p.m. Brian finishes his jumping jacks and bends over. coughing out blood. He stares at the stain for a second before walking somewhere off camera and coming back with 2 of the red paint buckets. He dips his hand into them and starts drawing a symbol on the floor around where he coughed out the blood. He draws a circle with a triangle with what looks like squiggly appendages coming out of the 3 triangle points. The bloodstain seems to be turning black now. Eventually it starts to move, and a bloodshot eye materializes from it, blinking rapidly. Once Brian has finished drawing the symbol, he walks into the center of the circle where the eye is, and gets on his knees and starts praying. When he does this, he mutters out a language that none of us are familiar with. Upstairs hallway. The twins walk out of the room, carrying a baby. Cal remarks that he recognizes the baby, it being the one that the family had first introduced him to. It is now unclear what the dad had brought out of the house in the morning. The twins set the baby down, and it begins crawling towards the guest room. Guest room, 5:25 to 5:50 p.m. The baby crawls around the room, seemingly at random. About 10 minutes of this occur before the closet suddenly opens on its own. The baby turns to look at the interior of the closet, and a worried look washes over his face. What he's looking at is unknown, being obscured from our angle. Eventually, a somewhat playful voice oozes out of the closet, babbling in baby talk. The baby suddenly smiles, and then starts crawling towards the voice. Once in, the closet shuts behind him and everything goes silent. The twins soon walk in the room, and soon after, sit cross-legged in front of the closet. They don't move at all. Kitchen, 5:12 to 5:45 p.m. The smoke seems to have gotten thicker and has obscured our view of the kitchen completely. The alarm has not gone off, however. Also, someone seems to be continuously laughing hysterically somewhere right in front of the camera. But the voice doesn't sound like it belongs to either Jake or the mother. It's too deep and distorted. In fact, it doesn't really sound human. Basement, 5:25 to 6:05 p.m. Unfortunately, we were too preoccupied with the other cameras that none of us had checked the basement for a while, so we missed about 10 minutes. At this point, Brian is praying erratically and speaking at an inhumanly fast rate. There's a tall, dark figure standing in front of him. It seems to be humanoid with clear, shiny skin, but no defining characteristics, other than a huge, singular eye in the middle of its face. This goes on for a while. Halfway through, Cal left and locked himself in the bathroom. I can hear him crying in there. In addition to this, Phil still hadn't said a word. He just watches the screen blankly with a glazed look in his eyes. We're going to need to keep an eye on him. Living room, 6:10 to 6:15 p.m. The dad finally enters the house, and there's an obvious sense of panic on his face. He seems to be holding a baby doll wearing the same clothes as the real one. On second glance, the doll actually seems to be alive, moving around in the father's hands. Upon realizing this, he screams and throws it across the room. As it starts crawling back towards him, he takes out a strange-looking knife from his bag and stabs it multiple times until it goes limp. His eyes wander to the kitchen, where black smoke was now pouring out in a torrid rate. His eyes widen with fear. He calls out, something along the lines of,
Honey, we can't do this anymore. Something went wrong.
At this point, he begins crying.
I can't fix it. We shouldn't have done this. I'm sorry.
He takes the knife and slits his own throat with it. As he falls to the floor, a creature that seems to be made out of the smoke quickly crawls over to him and drags him into the kitchen. The smoke is still obscuring the camera, but something wet is audible. It's hard to say what it is. Basement, 6:15 to 7:20 p.m. Again, we missed about 10 minutes in the basement. Brian seems to have been blended into the creature that he'd been standing in front of. His head sticks out of the creature's torso and his arms and legs are twisted, coming out at various angles through the creature's chest and ribs. Despite this, he's still praying. The creature walks off screen for a second, before bringing out somebody who's bound and gagged in a chair. It's Phil. Both Ricky and I looked at the Phil with us. He still wasn't moving, but he also wasn't expressionless anymore. A literal ear-to-ear grin suddenly materialized across his face. Slowly, Ricky walked backwards. While I kept my eyes on whatever that thing was in front of us, Ricky quietly picked up my hockey stick and charged towards it. The thing reacted quickly and turned around just in time to bite the stick in half and knock Ricky down. While they wrestled on the ground, I reached underneath my bed and pulled out my Colt. As I struggled to load the weapon, I heard Ricky call out and say that he'd got it under control. I looked over to see the fake Phil lying on the ground, with a piece of hockey stick lodged in its eye. Ricky had a large bite mark on his forearm, but he said that he was fine and sat back down in front of the monitors. I didn't know what else to do. I sat down as well. At this point, we've probably missed about 15 more minutes of the basement footage. When we checked back, the real Phil was lying on the floor with a big gash on his neck. The creature was now gone as well. Kitchen, 7:20 p.m. We've lost signals to this camera. I'm not sure why, but it's gone. Living room, 7:20 to 7:25 p.m. Jake and the mom are now lying on the floor with their limbs twisted beyond belief. About 5 or 6 of these large, half-spider, half-infant-looking things are now picking at their corpses. I have no idea where they came from. Upstairs hallway. The creature that merged with Brian is now pounding erratically on the guest room door. 7:25 to 8:07 p.m. The twins are playing patty cake while the closet shakes violently. This goes on for about 45 minutes before the creature finally bursts down the door. The twins scoot backwards in horror as the creature approaches them. As it gets about 2 meters away, the closet door suddenly swings open. The camera starts picking up a bunch of static. We hear something large dash across the room and hear an inhuman roar before we lose signal. Living room, 8:07 p.m. to 8:15 p.m. The spider creatures are now gone and everything is still. We wait for about a minute before one of the twins drags herself into view, sporting a mangled leg. She maneuvers herself onto the couch and rests for a second before picking up the box left by her mother on the coffee table. She puts it in her pocket. We observe as she sighs loudly while looking around the room. Eventually, we hear frantic knocking at the front door and a man's voice asking if everyone is okay. The girl just ignores it as she keeps wandering her gaze around. She meets the camera and stops. She squints for a second before flashing a bloody grin at us. It was at this point where we killed the feed, packed up the monitors, and drove out to the scrapyard and dumped them. When we got back, Phil's copy seemed to be dissolving, leaving behind a thick black liquid. It didn't even stain the carpet when we tried to clean it. After that, we barged into the washroom where Cal was lying on the floor shaking. We consoled him for about 2 hours before he finally came to his senses. After that, we just sat there for a while. Nobody said a word, and nobody had to. We all made a silent agreement never to mention this shit again. Ricky went home, and Cal slept on a spare mattress of mine. Well, he didn't really sleep. I didn't either. In the morning, I decided to drive out to the house again. I'm not really sure why. I guess I was just trying to get some sort of closure. I was hoping I would go there and nothing would be wrong. There would be a happy family playing in the front yard, and I could write this whole thing off as a horrific, vivid nightmare. Unfortunately, though, things don't work like that. As I drove by, I caught a glimpse of the place. It was burned down. A bunch of cops surrounded it, and they were talking to these guys in suits. I was about to turn my head back to the road, hoping to just forget this shit forever, when I saw her, the surviving twin, wrapped up in a blanket, sitting on the front steps. She was looking at me, and she was smiling.